It's been nearly 80 years since President Harry Truman made the decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. To this day, people still question whether it was moral or even necessary, believing that the war could have been ended some other way. However, if Truman ever regretted the decision, he kept those feelings to himself. In public statements, private writings, and private conversations, he consistently maintained that it was the right thing to do. "I have no regrets," he wrote in 1963, 18 years after the bombings, "and under the same circumstances, I would do it again." To some, this might sound callous. The initial explosion in Hiroshima on August 6th produced anywhere from 60,000 to 140,000 fatalities, and by the end of the year, thousands more died from injuries. Most of these were civilians. Fatalities from the Nagasaki blast on August 9th were anywhere from 20,000 to 60,000, and by the end of the year, total fatalities may have been as high as 80,000. Only 150 were military personnel. Many initial survivors later suffered agonizing fates from acute radiation poisoning, and many of those who didn't were still left maimed and burned. Photos and videos have preserved these grisly results and much more. By 1963, when Truman made his statement, he was well aware of most of these details. For each bombing, he learned of the high fatality count as early as the following day. Yet, in light of the Nagasaki bombing, he was prepared to drop a third bomb if needed. The military had already selected the target. Some military personnel even believed it would take 5 bombs in all. The military was ready, as was Truman. Quote, "We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war," Truman said in a statement after the second bomb was dropped. "Only a Japanese surrender will stop us." A third bomb wasn't needed. On August 15th, 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing, the Japanese emperor surrendered. This is what the Allies had been waiting for. By the time Truman took office in April 1945, there was no question in the minds of the American or the Japanese government that Japan couldn't win the war. There was only a question of when or if they'd surrender. Truman had 4 options. 1. Continue conventional bombings of Japanese cities. 2. Invade Japan with ground troops. 3. Demonstrate the atomic bomb on an uninhabited island. And 4. Use it on an inhabited city. More conventional bombing likely wouldn't deter the Japanese. The Americans had been strategically bombing Japan since June 1944. With civilian fatalities estimated at 250,000 at the low end and on the high end 900,000. The March 10, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo alone produced up to 90,000 fatalities. A ground invasion would likely produce the same results, except with the additional cost of American lives. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Americans had already been met with brutal resistance. Truman had every reason to believe the Japanese were committed to fighting for their emperor to the last man and woman and child. Some even believed that either of these 2 options would result in the extinction of the population of Japan, as city after city and town after town they would refuse to surrender. The death toll of any given battle made no difference to the Japanese, so the United States needed shock value. The government hoped that a demonstration of the raw and inconceivable power in a single atomic bomb would be enough to bring the Japanese government to its knees. Therefore, option 3 was to demonstrate the bomb's destructive power by using it on an uninhabited island. This could potentially bring an end to the war without further casualties, American or Japanese. However, this likely wouldn't be enough. Without massive fatalities and decimation, there simply wouldn't be enough of a shock. Even worse was the possibility that the United States would announce an island and a date for the bombing. And, with the whole world watching, the bomb would be a dud. it's likely the Japanese would only be encouraged to fight even harder, and the United States would look very weak in front of their other international neighbors. Therefore, the only viable option was dropping the bomb on a populated city. Just because Truman never regretted the decision doesn't mean it was easy. On April 12th, the day of Roosevelt's death and the day Truman took office, he was told briefly about a new super-destructive weapon, but it was only 2 weeks later, on the 25th, that he actually learned the details. In July, the Trinity test of the first atomic bomb was a success. Truman learned of this a few days later while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany. That night, he wrote in his diary, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark. This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I have told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target, and not women and children. And even if the Japs are savages, ruthless, merciless, and fanatic, we as the leader of the world for the common welfare cannot drop that terrible bomb on the old capital or the new. He and I are in accord. The target will be a purely military one, and we will issue a warning statement asking the Japs to surrender and save lives. I'm sure they will not do that, but we will have to give them the chance. It is certainly a good thing for the world that Hitler's crowd or Stalin's did not discover this atomic bomb. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the most useful." The first bomb was dropped on August 6th, a little less than 4 months after Truman began his presidency. Despite his initial desire that the weapon would only hit military targets, the fatalities were mostly women, children, and civilian men. Truman released a televised and radio statement again demanding unconditional surrender, or else more bombs would be dropped. Nagasaki was bombed on August 9th. 6 days later, the Japanese announced their surrender. While it's generally believed that Truman would have dropped a third bomb if necessary, he was certainly beginning to feel conflicted. On August 10th, the day after Nagasaki was bombed, he met with his cabinet. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace recalled Truman receiving in-depth reports and photographs from the Hiroshima bombing, which shook him. Wallace wrote about the cabinet meeting in his diary. Truman said he had given orders to stop atomic bombing. He said the thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrible. He didn't like the idea of killing, as he said, all those kids. More specifically, Truman had ordered that no more bombs be dropped without his express order. Later, when defending his usage of the bomb, Truman never brought up this potential doubt. As the Japanese ultimately surrendered on the 15th, it can't be known for sure if Truman would have ordered a third bombing. However, despite his initial reservations, it seemed that between the Nagasaki bombing and the surrender, he had once again resolved to use it. On August 12th, he replied to a letter written by a Protestant clergyman. The clergyman, Samuel McCree Cavert, urged Truman to cease the bombing. Truman responded, quote, "The only language they seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him like a beast." But maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe over the course of a prolonged land invasion, Japan would have eventually surrendered. Maybe continued conventional bombings would have done it. Some historians question if Truman had other motives for using the atomic bombs. Revisionists suggest that it wasn't so much a tragic and necessary final move of World War II against the Japanese, but rather the shrewd first move in a new war against the new enemy, the Soviets. They suggest that the bombings were effectively the first act of the Cold War. In this theory, Truman's main goal was to demonstrate to the Soviets the destructive power now at the United States' disposal. It is in fact known that Truman was told about the potential benefits the bombing would have in intimidating the Soviet Union. Many revisionists also suggest that the United States wanted Japan to surrender as quickly as possible so the Soviets didn't have time to take more Japanese territory and potentially invade mainland Japan. Even in his memoirs, Truman did say, quote, "I was not willing to let Russia reap the fruits of a long and bitter and gallant effort in which she had no part." Traditional historians acknowledge the effect on the Soviets as a motive, but not the primary one. The traditional narrative is also in contrast with the revisionist narrative in regards to Japanese lives. Whereas revisionists suggest Truman's decision was shrewd with no regards to Japanese casualties, many traditional historians argue that the atomic bombings might have saved more Japanese in the long run, or at least that's what Truman and the United States officials believed. Truman wasn't facing a categorical choice between not using the bomb and killing no one, and using it and killing hundreds of thousands. Fire bombings had already killed hundreds of thousands, and the Japanese showed no signs of relenting. Estimates of Japanese fatalities in a land invasion were staggering. Roughly 100,000 Japanese fought in the Battle of Okinawa. After 12 weeks of fighting, fatalities among Japanese military personnel were 80,000, and among civilians, 100,000. There were also the kamikaze planes, which by their very nature killed the pilots. It was estimated at least 1,000 kamikaze planes were armed and ready to defend Kyushu. Both American and Japanese officials believed a land invasion would result in fatalities of up to 1 million on both sides, but the Japanese seemed fully prepared for this. After all, the Japanese propaganda campaign in preparation for an Allied land invasion was called The Glorious Death of 100 Million. This campaign encouraged every man, woman, and child to fight and die for the emperor. A volunteer corps of 28 million men aged from 15 to 60 and women aged 17 to 48 was prepared as a second line of defense. With all of the best weapons and resources in the hands of the military, the volunteers were armed with outdated firearms, bows and arrows, knives, and even bamboo spears. High school student Yukiko Keisel was armed with a scratch-awl, a sharp-edged woodworking tool, and was told, quote, "Even killing one American soldier will do. You must aim for the abdomen." Anything was preferable to surrender, even if this meant jumping off cliffs, which many Japanese women did, sometimes while holding their children. As Joseph Grew, former U.S. ambassador to Japan, said, "I know Japan. I lived there for 10 years. The Japanese will not crack. They will not crack morally, or psychologically, or economically. Even when eventual defeat stares them in the face, they will pull in their belts another notch, reduce their rations from a bowl to half a bowl, and fight to the bitter end." Revisionist and traditional historians do agree that Truman was motivated by public pressure back in the United States. Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941. And by mid-1945, America had been fighting World War II for 3.5 years. The people were not only war-weary, but also eager for retribution. Historians generally agree that all of these were motives for Truman to some varying extent, but looking too closely at any one doesn't paint a complete picture. As Truman stated multiple times, his number one goal was to end the war as quickly as possible to save the maximum number of American lives. In private letters and public statements before, after, and long after, Truman repeatedly emphasized, "My object is to save as many American lives as possible." Most historians who've studied Truman closely agree this was the real crux of the matter. Truman had been warned about the massive amount of casualties that would result from a land invasion. One warning came from former President Herbert Hoover, who estimated it would cost 1 million American lives. Truman's military advisors said this was an overestimation. However, they did believe the number would be very high in the hundreds of thousands. Some today believe that even these numbers were overestimations. On the low end, some modern historians believe it would have been around 20,000, though this is likely far too low. On Iwo Jima, there were around 24,000 casualties, including 6,000 Marine fatalities. In the Okinawa invasion, there were around 50,000 casualties, with 12,000 fatalities. Okinawa was considered a preview for a mainland invasion. On that small island alone, Americans faced 100,000 Japanese troops. In the invasion of Kyushu, the first part of the mainland invasion planned for October, Americans expected to face 350,000 troops. Mid-range estimates placed American casualties around 132,000, with 40,000 dead. The next part of the plan, the invasion of Honshu, was estimated to add another 90,000 casualties. In preparation for the mainland invasion, the United States had minted 500,000 Purple Heart medals. Purple Heart medals are awarded to those wounded or killed in combat. Later, when defending his decision, Truman placed potential fatalities between 200,000 and 1 million. However, debating over the exact number might be missing the point entirely. It may have been the case that no matter how high or low, Truman would have made the same decision. Historian J. Samuel Walker, who's written extensively about Truman and the nuclear age, put it this way: if someone would have said to Truman, "Mr. President, if we don't use the atomic bomb, it's going to cost 200,000 American lives," Truman would have said, "Well then, we have to use it." "Mr. President, if we don't use the bomb, it's going to cost us 50,000 American lives," Truman would have said, "Use it." "Mr. President, if you don't use the bomb, it's going to cost 10,000 American lives. Use it," he would have said. "Mr. President, if you don't use the bomb, it's going to cost us 1,000 American lives. Use it." "Mr. President, if you don't use that bomb, it's going to cost us 50 American lives. Use it." Walker says the number of potential lives lost would have needed to be very low before Truman would have even considered if the long-term negative social and international effects would outweigh the loss of American lives. To Truman, the bomb was just a way to end the war quicker. It's probably no surprise that any American president would value the lives of his countrymen over a foreign population. But more than Roosevelt, more than Hoover, and more than most of the presidents of the 20th century up to that point, Truman probably saw value in American military personnel in a way the others simply couldn't, as he'd served in the military during World War I. In fact, he was the first president since Theodore Roosevelt, whose term ended in 1909, to have military experience. Also, he wasn't in a detached managerial position. He was an artillery commander. 33-year-old Captain Truman had a reputation among his men as a harsh disciplinarian. He was assigned a group of 194 unruly and hard-drinking young men in July 1918, and within a few weeks, he'd whipped them into one of the best-functioning batteries. Later, when his men came under fire from Germans, they panicked and tried to retreat. Truman began cursing and shouting at them until each one had retaken his post. However, he also ended up earning their complete respect and loyalty. As Private Floyd Ricketts noted, once Truman established who was boss, he showed a genuine interest in his men on a personal level. Ricketts also noted that provisions such as mess hall food significantly improved under Truman. He was able to earn his men's loyalty because they knew he was loyal to them. As another member of Truman's battery simply put it, Truman was going to back us up to the hilt for anything we did. All we had to do was do our duty, and he was going to back us up, and he did. On multiple occasions, Truman defied his superiors when he felt that they were treating his men unfairly. As military history writer Dennis Jean Greco put it, "The men knew that Truman would not hesitate to mete out deserved punishments, but would fiercely defend them against perceived injustices." Truman was once even threatened with a court-martial for an act of disobedience that in retrospect saved many of his men's lives. His battery made it through the end of the war without a single combat loss. In contrast, the 27,000-man division that Truman's battery belonged to lost over 7,000 men during the French campaign. Truman's men attributed their survival solely to his leadership. The bonds Truman formed lasted well beyond the war, as he stayed in touch with many of them through reunions and correspondences. 2 months after the war's end, however, he would suffer a loss. In January 1919, after the war, but before Truman was sent home, his battery clerk died from appendicitis. Truman wrote to his girlfriend, Bess Wallace, saying he now knew what it would be like to lose a son. He told Bess he cried like a baby. Perhaps in thinking of the troops prepared to invade the mainland, Truman remembered his own experience. Though his French campaign had been a success, Truman always believed that had World War I gone on for a few more months, he wouldn't have survived. Many historians ascribe his experience in the field as the reason he was so determined to save as many American soldiers as possible. One historian hypothesized that if Roosevelt had lived, he might have agonized more. For Truman, whatever decision saved more American soldiers was the right one, no matter how horrible the consequences. He repeatedly brought up the American lives spared when talking about the decision. The New York Times journalist Turner Catledge recalled an interview with Truman. "I asked Mr. Truman if he had any regrets of having ordered the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan. He said, 'Hell no. Wouldn't I have been a villain? Wouldn't I have even been a traitor if I had committed hundreds of thousands of American boys to an invasion of Japan, with all the casualties that they would have to take when a machine that would stop the war was lying idle on a factory floor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee?' With this in mind, it's easy to see, or at least gives perspective, as to why Truman never regretted his decision, or, as he outright claimed, never lost any sleep over it. He said dropping the bomb was a terrible thing. "Nobody is more disturbed over the use of atomic bombs than I am," he wrote to clergyman Samuel McCree Cavert. However, he was once again quick to mention the loss of American lives. Quote, "But I was greatly disturbed over the unwarranted attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor." Truman also mentioned the treatment of prisoners, which was always a concern. The Japanese were notoriously cruel to POWs. Thousands of Allied POWs were kept in Japanese captivity, where they were neglected, starved, tortured, and killed. In accordance with their honor code, the Japanese thought nothing of men who would allow themselves to be captured rather than dying in battle. In fact, one of Truman's reasons for not demonstrating the bomb on an uninhabited island was that he believed the Japanese may intentionally transport Allied POWs there. Truman once said, "It is an awful responsibility that has come to us," but he saw it as a responsibility he as the president had to bear. From his outlook, others could afford the luxury of bouncing around options. The people he called eggheads or Monday morning quarterbacks could spend time trying to find hypothetical solutions that made them feel good. But for him, it was simply about Japanese versus American lives. He had only been president for a few months, but he'd seen the death and destruction that had already been caused and would continue until the war ended. Perhaps it was this difference in perspectives that caused such a clash with others who were utterly horrified by the results of the bombs. On October 25, 1945, 2 months after the bombings, Truman met with Manhattan Project director J. Robert Oppenheimer. Though they started on friendly terms, Oppenheimer seemed so awkward and troubled that Truman asked him what was wrong. Oppenheimer responded, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Oppenheimer, a career academic, hadn't realized exactly what dropping the bombs meant until it was done, and once it was, his whole view of the world and himself was shaken. Accounts of Truman's reply ranged from him saying, "The blood is on my hands, let me worry about it," or "Never mind, it'll come out in the wash," or even simply handing Oppenheimer a handkerchief. They left on bad terms. "Blood on his hands," Truman said after Oppenheimer left. "He hasn't half as much blood on his hands as I have. You just don't go around bellyaching about it." He then said he never wanted to see that son of a bitch ever again. Oppenheimer saw the choice of killing no one or killing thousands, but to Truman, there was no clean decision. Whether a land invasion, continued bombings, or the atomic bomb, Truman would have blood on his hands. It was a question of whose blood and for how long the bloodshed would continue. Today, critics point to photos of the devastation and the horrifying maiming of atomic bomb victims, but Truman's defenders say that had he gone the route of a land invasion instead, we would simply be looking at different photos with horror. Photos of dead American troops and of Japanese women and children charging soldiers with bamboo spears rather than surrendering. Also worth noting is while the atomic bombings are well remembered today, the fire bombings had already caused countless fatalities. Truman once said, "The atomic bomb was no great decision. It was used in the war, and for your information, there were more people killed by the firebombs in Tokyo than dropping of the atomic bombs accounted for. It was merely another powerful weapon in the arsenal of righteousness. The dropping of the bombs stopped the war, saved millions of lives." For Truman, the dropping of the bomb was no great crossing of the Rubicon. In an instant, Oppenheimer might have gone from having clean hands to hands drenched in blood, but Truman's hands were bloody since the day he entered the White House. Nevertheless, it is still the most controversial and debated decision any president has ever made. There are certainly many contenders on a list of controversial presidential decisions. John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts, James K. Polk's entrance into the Mexican-American War, Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, Lyndon B. Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, but none come close to taking the #1 spot. Some have even called Truman a war criminal. At the time, however, he had no shortage of support. Virtually all political and military leaders agreed with him, along with most of the people involved with the Manhattan Project. One Democratic senator, Richard Russell, wrote so enthusiastically about using more bombs that Truman even rebuked him in a response letter. "For myself, I certainly regret the necessity of wiping out whole populations because of the pig-headedness of leaders of a nation, and, for your information, I'm not going to do it until it is absolutely necessary." After the bombings, opinion polls showed that 85% of Americans supported the decision. In fact, 23% wanted more bombs dropped. But perhaps most meaningful to Truman was the response from the military. Paul Fussell was a 21-year-old lieutenant who was scheduled to be part of the land invasion. When later interviewed about the end of the war, he said, "When the bombs dropped and news began to circulate that the invasion of Japan would not, after all, take place, that we would not be obliged to run up the beaches near Tokyo, assault firing while being mortared and shelled, for all the fake manliness of our facades, we cried with relief and joy. We were going to live. We were going to grow up to adulthood after all." Dr. Michael J. Devine was the director of the Harry S. Truman Library from 2001 to 2014. He said, "There was no week that went by that some veteran of World War II didn't state in the guest book, 'Harry Truman saved my life.' Children or grandchildren would write about their father or grandfather telling them over and over again how Truman had saved their lives because of the use of the atomic bomb." Also worth noting is that while he gets all of the credit, or all of the blame, Truman wasn't the sole force behind the atomic bomb. It had been in development for years, with over $2 billion spent on its production. Roosevelt had commissioned the project back in 1942. While many government officials knew details of the project, Truman wasn't one of them. He only learned of it in April of 1945, shortly after becoming president. Truman wasn't a trusted member of Roosevelt's team or even his preferred successor. Truman hadn't been Roosevelt's vice president for the prior 3 terms. Party politics had simply forced Roosevelt's prior vice president, Henry Wallace, off of the ticket for the 1944 election, and Truman was settled on as the compromise candidate that no one really wanted. During his 82-day vice presidential term, he was completely in the dark about the Manhattan Project. Historians generally agree that had Roosevelt lived, he would have made the same decision. In fact, some historians believe that Roosevelt wanted to use the bomb on the Germans as well. As mentioned, among those around Truman, there was overwhelming consensus in favor of dropping the atomic bombs. And while it's always said that Truman ordered the use of atomic bombs, there is actually no written record of him explicitly giving the order. His letter to Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, contains the words, "Release when ready." This was actually in regards to releasing a public statement about the bomb, but it's the closest thing to an official authorization from Truman. Truman did have the final say, but in many ways, it was a foregone conclusion. For his part, however, Truman never once used this to diminish his responsibility. As the sign on his White House desk read, "The buck stops here." A quote from 1964 demonstrates his attitude. "Nobody else could make the decision but me because I was the president, and the final decision comes from the president. The buck stops at the president's desk. He either makes a decision or he lets them go by default, and he can't afford to do that." It's possible this is what generated some of his disgust for Oppenheimer's guilt, as Truman saw it as his decision alone. If there was any guilt to be had, it was solely his. Truman met with Paul Tibbets, the pilot who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and asked him if he had received any flack. Tibbets said he hadn't, and Truman responded, "Well, if you do, if anybody gives you a hard time about it, you refer 'em to me, because it was my decision. I take responsibility." Another time he told Tibbets, "Don't you ever lose any sleep over the fact that you planned and carried out that mission. It was my decision. You had no choice." Early in his presidency, he told the British foreign minister, "I am here to make decisions, and whether they prove to be right or wrong, I'm going to make them." Truman was known to be decisive, for better or for worse, and to take responsibility for his decisions, for better or for worse. He maintained his attitude even into the darkest days of his presidency, even as he polled at a 22% approval rating towards the end of his second term. Journalist Turner Catledge said of him, "He was not a man who had remorse about anything, especially any decision he made as an official. Even when his decisions were wrong, he had no remorse about it. He went on to something else." And when it came to the bomb, Truman believed he was right. As President of the United States, I had the fateful responsibility of deciding whether or not to use this weapon for the first time. It was the hardest decision I ever had to make, but the president cannot duck hard problems. He cannot pass the buck. I made the decision after discussions with the ablest men in our government, and after long and prayerful consideration, I decided that the bomb should be used to end the war quickly and save countless lives, Japanese as well as American. In the decades between 1945 and the current day, there's been continued discussion about the decision. Was it ethically justified? What was the primary motive? Was the traditional narrative simply United States propaganda? Or were there actually other viable options for peace? Harry Truman died in 1972, 27 years after the bombing. In all that time, he never shifted responsibility or apologized. While he described it as the most terrible decision that any man in the history of the world had to make, he maintained that it saved American lives, and for that reason, he also maintained he would do it again without hesitation. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads. Patreon link in the description below.